I want to thank you for being here because I know that many of you have important commitments today in celebrating the women in your life, your mothers, your sisters, yourself, your daughters. And it is just such a pleasure for me to spend time with you and to recognize that this is also a little bit of a homecoming for me because as a mother, we have 3 boys who became Eagle Scouts thanks to your support of the Boy Scout troop here at this church. So I walked in looking for pickleball. Really appreciate that opportunity. Come on in. So one of the things I thought about, I deeply believe in serendipity, to trust the process. And as we were meeting with Sherry and talking about opportunities, we were thinking about different dates, and somehow the date of the 8th became open. And I said, sure, I can come on the 8th. Yeah, that's great. And then I began thinking as, the date approached closer and went, we're going to talk about hate on Mother's Day. Wow, I haven't done that before. And plus I've been living in Zoom land. So actually talking to human beings in person, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here and thought, how can I really think about this? Because context matters, right? That we think about not things in broad generalizations, but in the specific context of our community and today and what's happening now. And so it began for me to be a moment of pause to think about the women in my life, and particularly just to share one story, the story of my grandmother. I grew up in Ohio. My grandparents were grain and dairy farmers. And so, my idea of going to the beach was to go play in the cow feed and to build, do you bury yourself in the sand sometimes? No. We did it in the cow feed, right? That was a great time. We built forts in the hay mounds and had a great time. But also on Sunday dinners, right? My grandmother, I thought, could do everything, and she did, right? So she was in the fields and she milked the cows 7 days a week. But on Sunday dinners, it was also the time when everybody came to the table, right? And as a dairy farm, we had fresh cream. And one of my favorite dishes was, we called it cream potatoes, but it was basically boiled potatoes and then you ladle the cream and the butter on. Oh my gosh, it was wonderful. It's no wonder I have cholesterol issues. But we would pass that dish to every person at the table. It was so important that we would move the couch into the kitchen and we would move the kitchen table into the living room. And I have no idea, but when I was a child, that table went forever. It was the biggest table in the world. And my job was to go find the chairs in the house because every chair in the house came to the table so that we could sit together and pass the food around. So in this idea of when we gather together and we take pause to say whose voice is not at the table, when we're talking about solving issues and rising the occasion in our communities, it really is very literal for me to think about who's not at the table, right? Whose voice are we missing when we talk about homelessness, when we talk about all the issues and the challenges that face us, nothing done to us without us. Even with our good intentions, how are we making sure that we bring other people to the table to check our blind spots? Because we all have them, right? As human beings, how do we hear more and more voices? So happy Mother's Day to all the women in the room. Happy Mother's Day to your grandparents, to your daughters, to all of those, to the families that make that happen. And to the moms and dads and sisters and brothers that are present in working in the difficulty, in the challenges and the divisiveness that we have in this world. There is a work and a commitment here that is so much bigger than any one of us or any singular way of understanding the world in my perspective. You may be familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Buddhist monk, right? And he's very engaged in the idea of presencing and being present in the moment. And he says, when we hear the cries of the world, we must be engaged. And so I want to thank you for being engaged in the work that you're doing, right? And wherever it is that you find your place to do the work in this world, because not everybody hears that calling, obviously. Even in January of 22, you might be familiar with one of the investors in the Golden State, the basketball team. All right, so I'm from Gonzaga. I got just a few, not many basketball references, but in the Golden State Warriors, one of their investors, when talking about the genocide of the Uyghurs, which it has been identified as a genocide, right, going on today, that nobody cares. Right? And here's this really prominent individual, very, very wealthy individual. Of course, the NBA immediately said he speaks for himself, he doesn't speak for us. But these are issues that not everybody feels called to. And I just want to celebrate your being willing to listen to and think about the ideas of moving from the face of hate to the face of hope. So when we think about leadership, my position at Gonzaga University, I have kind of a split personality. I try to only have two at any one time, but I'm a professor in the School of Leadership Studies. And for the past 6 years, as Sarah mentioned, I've been the director for the Center for the Study of Hate at Gonzaga. In 1997, we found ourselves on our heels when some of our Black students at the law school were attacked. And they weren't physically attacked, but they were attacked by emails. And we thought, we just didn't know what to do. It was bad. And what came of that was the creation of this center, right? The Institute for Taking Action Against Hate was its original name. But now, 25 years later, our job is literally to convene the world with researchers to support people who are taking action, right? The activists in our communities, to figure out what it is that we need to do to create a more inclusive and a more welcoming world, right? We can't cure the dis-ease of hatred unless we can name that. And there's been a lot of pushback about the name, right? It sounds very weird to talk about hate, to study hate. How horrible is that? People say, how can you do that for 6 years? And I say, I can do it because it's the most amazing job in the world, because I get to talk with people who want to do something about it. And the thing is that one of the biggest challenges that I feel is that we can't talk with one another anymore. And I don't want to be hypocritical in checking myself and hating the haters. So how do I enter into that dialogue with folks to better understand where they're coming from, where their hurt is, and how we heal? So I think that's the role of leadership. I want to talk to you about leadership for just a moment, because that is how I frame this work. I understand leadership not as a position, not as a title, not as something that you get approval for. It's something that we choose to be responsible for, and how we influence the world in which we live every day, everyone, everywhere. So when I say leadership, please, yes, the ministers in this world have an important leader role, right? Yes, the people in our organizations that hold particular titles have an important role, but leadership is our work if we choose to embrace that mantle. So that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about all of us in how we play this role. So when we think about ethics and ethical leadership, some would say that that's kind of, redundant. Is leadership always ethical? And that's where I really want to start our work, is thinking about the leadership that people can provide, but that we don't always provide. I have a 5-minute video that comes from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and it's really, it's titled "We Were Neighbors." Right? To really think about what we as human beings have the possibility to do, both in our strengths and our limitations. So if you wouldn't mind starting the video.
Some were neighbors.
And among them was some of the people he went to school with, some of his best friends, the guys from the card club.
And out of that crowd came a friend of my father.
We were friends, I thought.
This was a boy that grew up with me for 16 years, and he could do something like this.
And that was my best friend.
They were neighbors.
The furniture and the glass was all in shatters. Everything was, my father's butcher store, the window was broken in and everything was demolished. And this was done by young people whom we knew.
After the Holocaust, many survivors recognized the roles of Adolf Hitler and other true believers. ideological hardliners who supported the Nazi Party early on and who viewed Jews as biologically inferior. But how could so many ordinary fellow human beings, even people they knew, have betrayed them, taken pleasure in their persecution, benefited in some way from their misfortune? Before the Holocaust, Jewish life in Europe was diverse. In some places, especially in Central and Western Europe, many Jews were integrated into the larger society through school, the workplace, and other settings. In Eastern Europe, many of the millions of Jews who lived there resided in predominantly Jewish communities, meeting non-Jews through business and the marketplace. After the Nazis took power in Germany, the new regime's goal was to deprive Jews of their rights and livelihoods and force them to leave the Reich. During World War II, Germany conquered and directly ruled vast areas of Eastern Europe. The marking and isolation of Jews from non-Jews were first steps toward their destruction. German-ruled Eastern Europe became the main terrain for the mass murder of Jews by Germans and their collaborators, including many Jews who lived far away in countries allied with or occupied by Germany, whom collaborating police often assembled for transport to the east.
One of the nastiest memories I have is going on that journey, and people were lined up the stairs up to the door of the apartment, waiting to ransack whatever we left behind, cursing at us, yelling at us, spitting at us as we left.
The Holocaust would not have happened without centuries of the longest hatred, prejudices, discrimination, and attacks on Jews and Jewish property. Jews were a religious minority in largely Christian Europe. Other pressures and motives, ones that affect individuals in less extreme circumstances, also came to the fore. Fears and pressures in school, work, and the community, roles as students, teachers, workers, police, soldiers, neighbors, friends, influenced their choices to go along with their peers or to defer to authority, even when they had some moral qualms.
This is the real truth. That was my girlfriend. We used to go to her together, have fun together, left together before the last test, before the graduation. We were studying together for nights and nights, and she did it to me, to us, to my family.
Many individuals also succumbed to pressures, risks, and age-old temptations. While it might be comforting to think that people were simply forced to do what they did, or that they were even brainwashed, examples of individuals who did help those in danger prove that people did have choices, even in the face of great risks and temptations.
So Leo had a great deal of our possession at that point. And we went to Leo for food. Now, I must impress upon you as to the character of Leo. Leo already had all the stuff that he could ever get from us, except maybe for some land. And all he had to do is tell us to get lost, and he would have never seen us again. He never did. He fed us all along.
I think that's such a powerful video in talking about the power that we each have individually to make individual decisions in our own spheres of influence, even when it seems so big and so overwhelming, right? That we do make our individual choices. And of the many, many great choices that are being made, the decisions that are being made in our community in Spokane, some of them you might already be familiar with. There's Spokane Faith and Action Values Network, right? There is the Faith Leaders and Leaders of Conscience for Eastern Washington and Northern Idaho. This group gathers people together for vigils on a regular basis to stand up and make statements about when harm happens to human beings and when harm happens to our earth. There is a group called Paths to Understanding, right? These are places where we are not alone in this work, but where we can come together because someone's already figured out to action. And for those of you who are interested in structural changes, like legislative changes in the state of Washington, the Faith Action Network, along with the other things that are going on throughout our community, but just a few of those things to bring our attention, because too many times what I hear, the most common mantra that I hear in my work is that things are falling apart, but we don't know where to start. We don't know what to do. It's not okay, but what can I do? I'm just a single person. And the thing is that there are lots of places to enter into taking action into this work. And when we think about what's going on in the divisiveness of whatever way you want to frame that, of how we understand them versus us, fundamentally, there are a couple things that are going on. There is exclusive in-grouping, excessive exclusive in-grouping going on. The assumption that our own group has exclusive validity and that people of the other group have less value. Right? And the other concept really significantly is dehumanization, a process in which in-groups are seen as, the groups that are outside our in-groups are seen as less than human, and that makes it okay for them to be targets of violence because they're not human beings anymore, because we've thought of them as less than human or dehumanized them with this work. So in-group bias has a sense of superiority towards the other groups, and we believe that conflict is inevitable with them. So dehumanization is a false and exaggerated claim because we think that those people don't fall into our moral guidelines of how we would treat people in our in-group. We would never do that to our people, our family members. We would never call them names like that, but somehow it's okay to call them by those names. So our work is to find a life-giving response to those forces, right? I think that's what we're called to do, is to name the dis-ease and then to take responsibility, right? The ability for us to respond when we see those things happening in our communities. So what do, right? The fundamental practices of eating, playing, and sharing stories with each other to remember our humanity. Can you go ahead and switch this on, please? Awesome, thank you. So a couple of the names that you may already be familiar with in terms of different groups in our communities. Are here with this work, among many, many, many others. Some of you might be familiar with some research that's been done about what happens with groups, and when there's competition, we actually tend to really see our in-groups as being better and the other groups as not being as good. That goes back to research in the 1950s. And I think that this is really interesting. This is Sharif's Robbers Cave experiment first, and then I'll talk about Ash's conformity experiment. Just going back to reminding us of research that is older, but it is time when conformity was a part of the American ethos. There was a lot of pressure to belong to say whatever the group says. So I think it puts some really interesting, it shines an interesting light on this older research. Current research research in the 80s and the 90s had different outcomes. But let's look at what happened in this. This happened in the 1950s when they were doing this research. They took a group of 11-year-old boys, they sent them to camp, and they put them in two groups. They had the Rattlers and they had the Eagles, and they competed with each other. And after 4 days of competition at camp, just generally speaking, a regular kind of day camp thing, the boys, when asked to describe the other group, automatically gave their group superlatives and gave the other group derogatory comments about, and this is day camp, right? So it creates that sense of cohesiveness, which is great. But when the experimenter, when Sharif tried to say, okay, let's remember, we're all the same family that came together to go to this camp. We're all the same group of boys that started at the very beginning. Just putting them together was not a way to resolve those in-group and out-group differences. It really took a common goal or a common project for us to come together on. So when you think about what are the things that we do together as a whole, there's really tremendous significance in bringing diversity together, different groups together for that common cause, because unless we have that common cause, just being in the same space is not going to help us get past these senses of competition. And the thing is that when we're in our groups, we are smart people, we're adults here. We can do really fundamentally, basically easy tasks like in this experiment, which Ash did in the same time period. It was called a line experiment or a vision experiment to those who are participating in it. This line here on the left is the target line. And what the task was that the person that was involved in the experiment was to say which line on the other side of the chart, ABC, is the same length. Right? So they called it a vision test. That's what the person thought they were signing up to experiment for this experiment. And that's a pretty simple test, and we all ought to be able to do it. However, there was a table, and there were people involved in the experiment that were Confederates or participating rather than being the unknown person who didn't understand what was really going on. It's really the object of the experiment. So the beginning of the table, the first people at the table had all agreed that they were going to give false answers in 12 of the 18 times that they ran the trial each time with a different line. And so then it got to the final person who didn't understand that they were the only person that was not in on the experiment. 32% of the time, that last person went along and said the wrong answer. 75% of the people, remember there were 18 times they ran this experiment, 18 times with each group. 6 of them were correct, 12 of them were wrong. 75% of the time, people said an incorrect answer at least once. This is a really easy thing, right? The pressures to conform when there is nothing at risk here. There's no harm going on here. This is a simple kind of thing. As human beings, we need to own our humanity and really appreciate how important the context is of where we put ourselves and the pressures that other people face when they're told certain stories, and how we have to ask ourselves, how we have to think for ourselves, what is the truth for us individually, because we are social creatures and we really struggle with this idea of conformity. So there are a lot of, kind of critiques about this experiment, but in a number of different ways it's been replicated in talking about the pressures of conformity. So when we think about all the us's and theming that are going on, what I would really like to do in putting that in context is that those things that seem relatively innocuous, right? Just calling people names, really build a foundation to what's been called the 10 stages of genocide, right? We can think about this as when you look at genocides that have happened in the world, at their foundation, every single one of them started with using and theming, started with in-groups and out-groups. Now, that doesn't mean that every single in-group and out-group ends up in genocide, thank God, right? However, when you start with a kind of funnel visualization that all of the using and theming that goes on that's normalized then leads to these additional states of symbolization, right? Where people wear certain garbs or have certain visual cues, they belong to certain groups, and they move through to discrimination where their rights are limited, where they're not allowed to do this, they're not allowed to do that, they're not allowed to vote, whatever the case may be. Thank you. That eventually we get narrow and narrower to the few, thankfully few, but still existent cases of genocide in the world, right? So we can start with really recognizing the importance of when we hear us and them kind of language, because it matters, right? So when we think about taking people's dignity through the media, through medical experimentation or land confiscation, when Black people are associated with apes, when Native American mascots like Chief Wahoo, I mentioned that my family comes from Ohio, right? Chief Wahoo was, in a very different way than the Spokane Indians tribe has been handled, very, very different. Chief Wahoo was very much a caricature and is no longer the mascot for the Cleveland Indians. But interesting story to think about how Spokane has handled our relationship with the Spokane tribe, but very different in Ohio with Chief Wahoo. So we can think about genocide in terms of the bottom of this happening not very often, but still happening in Rwanda, still happening in Cambodia, still happening with the Uyghurs today. And a comment I think that rings for me that comes from Madeleine Albright that she made not too long ago. She said, the two most dangerous words in the human vocabulary are us and them. Remembering our motto, e pluribus unum, out of many one, and we the people is an inclusive phrase, right? Martin Luther King stated the biggest stumbling block is the white moderate who's more devoted to order than to justice. When we're timid to interrupt, when we see and hear others classified or excluded. Silence is not an action. So what I want to share with you, this is actually a really I am so excited to share just a story with you that you've probably read about the Spokesman Review. Carla Pepperzak is this 98-year-old Wonder Woman. Oh my gosh, she's so amazing. She's 98 years old young. She happens to be receiving an honorary doctorate today at Gonzaga, which makes me pretty proud. But you might have read about her in the Spokesman Review because up on 63rd Street, there is a new school, a middle school that's been named after her. So that will open in 2023. The naming was official. This was made official. The groundbreaking was this in March of this year. But Carla, when she was 18 years old, she was a Dutch resistance fighter. She loved to study. She had a sister who was a little bit more flirtatious. But Carla studied medicine when she was in school, when she was a child. And she was a rower. So she learned a lot of discipline and she had a lot of physical strength and stamina from her physical activity when she lived just a couple doors down actually from Anne Frank. But this is one of our Spokane mothers, right? So I thought this would be great to celebrate and talk a little bit. So, and what she did, however, when she was 18 years old, was that she helped save directly 40 people who were Jewish. And she did that by helping them find places to hide. She did that by, once she found them hiding places, bringing them ration cards, and by bicycling, which she could do as a female nurse, because she had a nursing uniform because she studied medicine, right? It's amazing kind of confluence of the variables she had in her life and how she could take action. This is what worked for her. But she is Jewish as well. So she could bicycle. Taking those threats, she could still bicycle in her nursing uniform to let people know what was happening and how the war was progressing, what was happening with the Allies. And she would take them ration cards. And she would actually change cards from being denoted with the J on them as Jewish. She had one of the machines where she changed the cards, people's identification cards with her, and she was stopped by some Nazis. And because she had her own flirtatious skills, she was able to flirt with the Nazis and speak German very, very fluently. And they even carried the case for her that had the case opened, she would have been killed on the spot. I can't even imagine, like thinking about that, just wow. So this amazing woman who continues as a 98-year-old to speak out, to say, never forget. Right? To remember, this is real, this is my life's experience. Nobody is making this up when we talk about the Holocaust. So incredible, fall of 23, the middle school will open here in Spokane. So really, really proud of that. So thinking about where we fall on this continuum of action, right? Because it all matters. When we start with where we are at in our own context, with our own connections, with our own energy, whatever that may be. Right, the first two areas on this continuum, actively participating in othering. All right, I'd suggest definitely moving out of the last two here on the left, they're adversarial roles. when we have people actively participating or denying and ignoring what's happening to human beings in our community. But then, right, Carla was already all the way at the extreme, right? She was trying to prevent the death to human beings. But there are a lot of steps in the middle, right? Many of us, I don't think I'll ever do anything as heroic as Carla did in that time. But that doesn't mean that I don't have a place somewhere along the continuum for taking action. So I have a lot of materials in here that are far too much for our conversation today, but I'm glad to share a resources page with you, right? And some of them, so I talked about some of the local resources, but some of them are global resources as well. How do we think about this as a global community? And this link here is to the United Religions Initiative, where there are 1,000 cooperation circles as another possible circle to think about what's right in our community, right? Well, do we start one here? Do we modify something? Maybe you already have something like that going, but it's a commitment to interfaith peace building in a global context. And the concept really here is a global one, because we can think about Ubuntu, right? It's the ancient African word of I am, because we are, right? We are in this together. And the people, the principle of Sankofa, which is this image up here in the top right-hand corner. You may have seen it before. It comes from Ghana and West Africa. It reminds us that we should remember our past in order to create a positive future, right? So here with this bird, the word Sankofa literally means to retrieve, to come from the proverb that says it's not taboo to go back and to fetch what you've forgotten, right? Here it reminds me of how powerful knowing our history is and our heritage in order to know how we can, who we are currently and how we can engage in the world around us to better the world. So whether that's engaging in others' right to vote, helping to encourage people to vote, or working with the legislative processes, hate incident reporting, lots of different ways to be involved here. But fundamentally, educating yourself so that you can educate others in this process and move towards the skills of being able to enter into dialogue, right? I think that's fundamentally a skill that we need to find how to practice in terms of interrupting in the educational process so that we engage rather than censor people. I deeply, deeply believe is supported by the United Nations that when we stop hate speech, I'm very, very committed, and this is a very important conversation for people to have, but when we stop hate speech, we drive it underground, and then we don't know what's happening in our communities. So how do we meet people where they're at to work for transformation and not transaction? How do we really create the deep change that we're really hoping to get to eventually in a beloved community? So how do we think about this in terms of another mother? Charlene Teeters is a member of the Spokane tribe. And she said, in my life, I must not only make things better for the coming generations, but also pass on how to do this. And a part of the commitment is through the humility of knowing that we're going to get it wrong. It's going to be difficult. We don't have all the answers, right? So how are we embracing that humility is good? Humility is okay. To be curious and not judgmental about others, right? In asking the questions, that skill of dialogue and grace and empathy, in knowing that people come from all sorts of hurt and harm. And how do we embrace that hurt and harm so that they can heal in this process? So, 15, is that right? Okay. Just a couple things that I want to mention to you before we move on here real quickly to talk about other things that are going on in Spokane, because I think this is about power, right? It's about naming the disease, and it's about the choices that we have as individuals in terms of what makes sense to us. But fundamentally, when you're thinking about this work, taking care of yourself to avoid burnout, knowing and being willing to make mistakes along the way, not waiting till you have it perfect, is so important. I think I would like to encourage you just to lean in to the possibility, right? And understanding our own growth. We don't get better at it until we cultivate that support from others in this practice. So in Spokane, you might be aware that we are in the process of getting an Office of Civil Rights, Equity, and Inclusion. This is really kind of brand new, right? It's not even 6 months old. And so Curtis Robinson is pictured here at the bottom. So I just want to give a shout out to the guys, right? Because we all need guys in the world. And Curtis Robinson just really wants to support this initiative as the former president of the NAACP. Keantha Duncan is the current president. But we have a long ways to go, right? But we've started this work. We just need to recognize that we've got a long move on this learning curve. So when this was started, right, when we look at benchmark other communities in our region, we can look at Des Moines, Iowa, we can look at Madison, Wisconsin, we can look at Portland, Oregon, or Tacoma, Washington. I actually authored a white paper with my husband looking at benchmarking these different offices, where we either look within the state of Washington, but not too many cities are same size, or look within cities in the Pacific Northwest that are about our same size to say, okay, what are other folks doing here? They have budgets of $800,000 committed to this work, right? In a range, that's the top, or that's one end, 4.5 million is the other end. That's a lot of money, but that's the commitment that these communities have to trying to figure out how to create more inclusive and welcome communities. So what do we have here? We have a commitment in the budget for $340,000 to begin this work, right? We have a commitment to a 3-person office with the hope of it getting to a 6-person office in the not too distant future. So this Office of Civil and Human Rights is going to partner with another group we have in our community you might be familiar with. So the Office of Civil and Human Rights serves the Spokane city. Well, that's very important and that's great, but we live out here in the county. And many of the complaints that get reported to the NAACP, at least according to Curtis and the group, are from the county, right, where harm occurs. So the Spokane County Human Rights Task Force, that's what this group is up here. That's their logo, the orange and the yellow. They, believe it or not, we didn't have a way to report hate incidents in our community until just a couple years ago. And so this momentum is beginning to build the more that people are aware of it. So this is something that I really hope that you will share with others if you ever hear about people who feel like they've been targeted or you ever observe a hate incident. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. There is a way to report for the state of Washington. And so this reporthatebias.org is the website that you would go to. But really, if you just put in Spokane report hate bias, it shows up. And it's a way you can anonymously post what's going on. But what really matters is the data collection, right? And if it's needed, the data gets reported out to the law enforcement, right? There's an entire process behind it. But these are community members in the Human Rights Task Force. These are volunteers doing this work. But what we need is the data because we don't have accurate data. And so we can't do things when we don't have accurate information. We can't target our resources. We can't be strategic. We don't really know no data doesn't mean that nothing's going on. It means that nobody's reporting it, right? And so how do we get accurate reports when we look to see what's happening in our community? So if things happen in our state, we also have the Human Rights Commission, right? So wanting to be able to sort through what is a hate crime versus what is a hate incident versus what is hate speech, right? And so a hate crime happens because there is a crime that occurs. The primary difference between a hate crime and a hate incident is because the crime occurs and that it's been motivated in the state of Washington, by a victim's race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender expression or identity, mental, physical, or sensory disability. We have a pretty good idea of how the people get targeted, right? Because of their disabilities. They get targeted all the time because of any number of different things. So when we think about what this means in our community, we can think about what happened in Temple Beth Shalom just in the spring. In the spring of February of 2021, a year ago, Temple Beth Shalom was vandalized and they painted swastikas on the temple and they defaced a Holocaust memorial. And then if you were following in the news, the person that did that, who did belong to a white supremacy group, was given 7 months in jail and a fine of about $10,000. And very importantly, the mayor made a comment, Chief Meidel made a comment in terms of how this is not who we are as a community in Spokane. That as a community, we welcome different faiths and there is no place for hate mongering here. Couple things that I just want to share with you in terms of resources if you're curious about. So what does this mean from the city to the county to the state to the region? One resource is the Southern Poverty Law Center that puts together the hate map. Really, really incredibly very interesting to me. If we look at Spokane, right, we have the Proud Boys, the Act for America, the Sure Foundation Baptist Church, right, as a couple of the hate groups that are in our community that are a part of the larger, there are also statewide hate groups in our community. To give you kind of a flavor for this, some quotes from Act for America. Unless the West wakes up to the fact that their culture and way of life is eroding through immigration from the Islamic world, the values of the Islamic world will overrun and overtake us. Europe will no longer be Europe by 2050. Europe has already become Eurabia. Europe is Eurabia right now. So a lot of Islamophobia in what they're putting out there and a lot of protection, right? I'm going to share with you some other things that I just checked on this morning in terms of how they're communicating their message. The Proud Boys want to distance themselves from the racist alt-right. However, they say things like white majority countries are on a path to extinction. So a lot of fear mongering about we're going to face our end and we better get our weapons together, right? Because we've got to protect ourselves. And it's really about, it speaks to the limbic system in our brain about, how do I respond to threat if I'm threatened by extinction? Another source, right? So in research, you always want to triangulate, right? So another source is the Antidefamation League, and they have the heat map. So the heat map actually stands for hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism. And so in this heat map, what they document are people reporting situations, and mostly in Spokane, those are propaganda, right? So that kind of middle area of the 10 stages of genocide, right? We're getting lots of propaganda drops that are saying, join us, protect your race, and lots of concerns, name calling and dehumanizing LGBT groups and others. So what do you know when you see what's going on in some of this propaganda? If you're not familiar with this, and I have to tell you, I didn't know this stuff before, I don't know, I just didn't know. It wasn't part of my life. But we really ought to be familiar with the number 14. Specifically 14 and 88, because the 14 words came from David Lane. And many of you might have been in Spokane in the 1980s when the order was doing a lot of horrific violence, right? They actually assassinated someone in Colorado. They came from our. These are the words that are the most famous white supremacist words. These are the 14 words. This is what 14 refers to when somebody uses that intentionally along these lines. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. That's what people are doing. They're fighting for a cause. They're fighting for their white kids. I got 3 white boys. So when we think about this also, so you see the tattoo. This is a pretty blatant one on the right-hand side, 14 and 88. I'll talk about 88 here in a moment, but on the left-hand side, I want to show you this, right? Again, so this is my only other basketball reference. If you watch basketball, what do you think of with this? Okay, yes, and the three-pointer. God bless the three-pointer for Gonzaga. We just need it so much. And it's also a W and a P. It's a W and it's a P. It's white power. Here's the struggle. Do we let somebody else claim a national symbol for people who watch basketball? Or for people who just say, hey, okay, that's awesome, I'm with you. I'm not with white power though. So we could say, all right, we'll give that up and we'll go for 3. If you have wrestling families, so my boys all wrestled, this is a 3. And yeah, that's good. There's no WP there. Maybe a W, but anyway, yeah. But that's a part of the challenge of how do we figure this out? There aren't clear answers, but we just need to be aware. So it's a real challenge when you watch the games, right? There are people doing this going, we're not going to give up that symbol. We know what that means. We claim its definition. Nobody's going to take it from us. And I totally get that. And there are other people doing this. We've got to try different things to find our way out of this. So just to be aware. We also know, oh, sorry, wrong way. Okay, so we know what we've seen in our own community, right? So these are literally flyers that were taken from Hayden, Idaho in 2000 when the Aryan Nations compound was taken down. And I show them with you here because this is the slide that I want to get to. This is a slide of an ordinary group of people who got together in living rooms and started the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. Now, you can't live in this region without having known their name because for 40 years they've been doing this. So this is Tony Stewart, and this is Norm Gissel and his wife, Deanna, and they were part of the central core team of the Kootenai County Task Force who continues to this day to try and figure out how do we stand up for human rights? How do we stand against a human hierarchy of value where some people think they're better than other people? And it was actually a mother and her son that brought down the Aryan Nations. And so I found that oftentimes people are already familiar with this story, and I know we're kind of running it short on time, but fundamentally guards heard their car, the mother and a son's car backfire that was running along the road. They thought somebody was shooting at them. So they came chasing after the Keenans, the mother and the son, and they dragged them out of their car. They shot at their car. And that was the instance that pulled the court case together that bankrupted the Aryan Nations so that the land had to be sold. And there's some really, I mean, just thinking strategically, there are things that just make me so proud of this community because the land was sold, the money went to, so Robert Butler didn't have the money to give to the Keenans. It was a $6 million award. He didn't have that kind of money. So he had to sell the land. A philanthropist came in for the $6 million, gave it to the Keenans. So the Keenans were restored in some way. But the land became a peace park. And it was to remain a peace park for 20 years. It was just sold within the past couple years. The money from the land, from the trees that were on the land, was sold in order to create some revenue to generate for the human rights group. And now the money from selling the land has endowed a chair at North Idaho College. So it is continuing to say, as a community, we now have, it's called the Gregory C. Carr Human Rights Chair, so that every year they will bring human rights speakers in to talk to their community. And that all came because of the horrors of the Aryan Nations. I would never wish that in the first place, but if we got to do it, they found some good in it, which I think is just a really wonderful story about how it continues even 20 years later to create a power for good in our community. So a couple other things when we think about our region. We have to recognize how Christian faith has been redefined in really horrific, unchristian ways, right? And the Christian identity movement is a part of what Richard Butler founded and spread and propagated. So he not only was the founder of the Aryan Nations, he was a founder of something called Jesus Christ Christian as a Christian identity movement. And so you may see the numbers 83, so Heil Christ. You'll see 88 is Heil Hitler on the previous side. But this is a part of what is horrifying and heartbreaking. It's not just about how do we define WP anymore. It's about how do we define what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a person of faith? Because what they really wanted in their declarations was to create a separate Northwest territory, right? These 5 states, the goal was to secede. And we can see parts of a conversation that may be we have this history of seceding. Part of our history of who we are. And again, I tell you these stories because we have individual decisions and we have individual choices we can make in our own spheres of influence when we know and understand our context and our region and what we're called to do. So what's going on today, right? You may have been reading about this in Hayden, Idaho. There was a group in March that came. I was part of the Aryan Freedom Network, the AFN. They held a private, it's a new strategy. They held a private gathering outside of Hayden. So nobody could go and see how many people actually showed up. Were they the same people that show up that just travel around the country that claim to be a part of this group? And so really there's only a half a dozen of them, but they just keep showing up in the same place over and over. So they did this privately. It was very hard to tell. But the beautiful thing was that Idaho's Love Lives Here group collected people together to stand on the streets and do a honk and wave and to really stand for what they aspire to in the state of Idaho as a beautiful state that it is, and not to let someone else take their state over. When we think about White Lives Matter, it really is, I just want to say this, it's a response to Black Lives Matter, right? It doesn't exist, it exists because it is against the Black Lives Matter movement. It is not a pride in understanding who they are. It is a pride about saying we are better than you and you will not take over this conversation. Just a couple things here, and then I want to end with things that I hope really, really empower you. Our U.S. Justice Department and the U.S. Attorney's Office, Merrick Garland, are working on these issues to elevate them, to talk about them at the highest priority. Oh, I'm sorry, I want to mention one really horrific thing before I get to the good stuff. Well, I looked this up this morning before I came, and I just wanted to cry. So there's a website that this AFN work kind of spreads their communication, the message through. It's called fightpower.org. So number one, it's a .org site. Dagnabbits, because that's how, how do you tell what's credible anymore? Well, .org kind of sounds a little bit more trustworthy. So I went to the whitepower.org, and in the middle, it's what I checked this morning to see what was up there. And one of the images they have up there behind a swastika, really, it's an honest to God swastika, the same thing that you saw in that black and white video. It is a swastika, is the calling to love, not hate, and to love your race. You don't get love. I'm sorry, I draw the line on that one. That is not love, no matter what your worldview is. I think that love has this definition of Ubuntu. So anyway, what are we doing? What's going on? Where are the structural changes happening? Because I do think that there really is good news here. So all the people in this country, according to Garland, should be able to live without fear of being attacked or harassed because of who they are, where they're from, what they look like, whom they love, or how they worship, right? And so in the first part of 2021, about a year ago, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was signed into law. There are a number of ways that we can really identify how this is something of import to some of our elected officials when they talk about the growing concern of threats from violent extremist groups, and particularly the white supremacists and the anti-government activists, in terms of new domestic counterterrorism units that were started in the first week of 2022. So there is a response to try and say, we have to pay attention to this, that the terrorism caseload exploded. They use the word exploded since early 2020, in particular cases involving racial or ethnically motivated crimes. So here in our local community, Vanessa Waldrop, you might be familiar with her from the United States Attorney Eastern District of Washington, is working to develop a civil rights outreach program. And you may see that her office is putting on programs that you'll be interested in. So we can look for more information. Again, how are we triangulating what we know to try and figure out what's really going on here? Well, another source is, of course, the FBI hate crimes report. It is very interesting, should you happen to want to explore this, to look at the FBI Hate Crime Data Explorer, where you can begin to sort who, when, why, changes, what is being officially reported in our communities. So again, another resource if you're curious about that. Oh gosh, okay. So, well, I can leave you with just a couple things here real quickly as we wrap things up. Number one, I want to leave you with a statement from another mother who is Dorothy Day, a Catholic social worker. What else do we all want, each one of us, except to love and be loved in our families, in our work, and in our relationships, right? I had the opportunity to talk 2 weeks ago with an individual named Sean Gillespie, who is a former member of one of the most extreme skinhead groups, who just got out of jail 2 years ago, and for 2 years has been working to try to do better, to do good in the world. And I asked him about his transformation, right? It's been 2 years, he could slip and fall, but he came to this work because he was looking for belonging. He came to the white supremacy groups because he was looking for belonging, because of the hurt and the harm in his life. And he's working to try and make how much harm and hurt he created in other people's life, and to be restorative about it, right? To own the harm that he did, but also then to put good in the world, to be apologetic and accountable, but also to say, I need to restore those things that have happened. And so I think that what that really speaks to is, how are we not shutting down our neighbors? How are we engaging in conversation? Maybe starting with common ground. When we can talk about whatever the local high school football team or whatever it is, right? The local meal, the flowers in the yard. How do you start a conversation? Even when they have a sign that's different from the sign that's in your yard, whatever the sign in your yard may be. So the work is big, and there's a lot of work to do. But I want to leave you with a very short video, and it's the story of the hummingbird. While he's getting us set up, this video is just 2 minutes long. And I just find it really inspirational when I think about how heavy the load is and how we can each do a little part of it. But I want to leave you with these ideas while this gets set up, right? Whatever it is you decide to do, wherever you're at on the continuum of taking some kind of action, right? Of moving past, okay, I know, now what do I do, right? My responsibility in this work is that on September 21st, there's the International Day of Peace. How are you participating in the International Day of Peace? On November 16th, there's the International Day of Tolerance, right? This is a global community coming together to do this work. And if you want to do something local, bring your mother, bring your brothers, bring your sisters, your daughters, bring your whole family to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial exhibit about Americans in the Holocaust that'll be on the Gonzaga campus during the month of October next fall. It's free. Anybody can come. Bring your youth groups, bring your whomever that you engage with. But hopefully there is some way that you find that doesn't take, wherever you find yourself on a continuum, you find someplace to find your voice. So I'll leave you with this last video. Again, it's just 2 minutes long.
We are constantly being bombarded by problems that we face, and sometimes we can get completely overwhelmed. The story of the hummingbird is about this huge forest being consumed by a fire. All the animals in the forest come out, and they are transfixed as they watch the forest burning, and they feel very overwhelmed, very powerless, except this little hummingbird. It says, I'm going to do something about the fire. So it flies to the nearest stream, takes a drop of water, and it puts it on the fire and goes up and down, up and down, up and down, as fast as it can. In the meantime, all the other animals, much bigger animals, like the elephant with a big trunk, could bring much more water. They are standing there helpless, and they are saying to the hummingbird, what do you think you can do? You're too little. This fire is too big. Your wings are too little. And you're big, so small, you can only bring a small drop of water at a time. But as they continue to discourage it, it turns to them without wasting any time and tells them, I am doing the best I can. And that to me is what all of us should do. We should always feel like a hummingbird. I may feel insignificant, but I certainly don't want to be like the animals watching as the planet goes down the drain. I will be a hummingbird. I will do the best